Hello and a warm welcome to the programme, which once again comes from a garden in the heart this time of the Essex countryside. It is in fact a magnificent evening, and there is no doubt that if one was sitting by the river in Grantchester, the sunset would again be a blazing sea from Haslingfield to Madingley. But one is not. One is in fact not too far from Thaxted, and in the company of the man best known perhaps for his role as Tinker in the television series Lovejoy. His name's Dudley Sutton. He's the son of a gambling machine manufacturer. He was born in 1933, and as the sun dropped over the yard arm and the tea arrived, I asked him where he first went to school.
Because of the things were a bit chaotic just before the war, I went to quite a lot of schools. I was at council schools around Surrey. And then the war came, and I went to quite an exclusive English prep school down in South Devon, which was an amazing place, dedicated to music and literature. And it was run by second-generation German Jews who were very kind of intellectual and very modern for that time, very advanced. They were in as much as they didn't do the usual English prep school thing of forcing you to do sport if you didn't want to do it, and things like that. And they cared more about literature and music and stuff and drama.
And how old were you when you embarked upon that bit?
7. I mean, the only reason we went there was because there was a family living in the same block of flats, and we'd been virtually bombed out in South London. And they were sending their child down to that school, so my dad said, well, you better take ours as well. So they'd all be together.
How long did you stay there?
I think 6 years.
So that brings you to about 13. Had you by then got any designs on what you wanted the future to hold for you?
No, none at all. Except the only thing I was any use at was the school play. Oh, and English.
So what school after that?
Victoria College in Jersey, in the Channel Islands. I couldn't stand it. In fact, I went back there years later to Jersey when I did a Bergerac, and I went up and looked in through the college windows, and I blanked the whole place out. It had no resonance for me whatever. It was extraordinary. But it was one of those places that was built in about 1850 odd to look as if it was built in 1150 odd.
Was it strict or was it easy?
Well, it wasn't too bad because I lived with my dad, who had a cottage in a fishing village called Roselle, which then was very charming and is now right under the flight path.
That's right.
And our old house has now got, we were right on the slipway, and there was a restaurant in the living room, there's a restaurant even in the garage, and there's a restaurant, the little concrete thing on top where we used to sit when we were kids. Mm-hmm. Because the Germans had only left a short time when we went there. It was a great place.
Yeah. So when you left there, what happened next?
Oh God, when I left there as soon as I could. Luckily my dad had business difficulties and he pulled us out of this school, and I ran off to London as quickly as possible with 11 quid I think I had in those days. I knew a couple of waiters at the Piccadilly Grill, and I hung out with them. I got very depressed. I was always depressed when I was a kid. Terribly depressed. I used to go to a lot of very gloomy art films and get even more depressed. You know, sort of German expressionist film. Go twice a day and wonder why I didn't feel very cheerful. And I got so fed up I joined the Air Force.
Did you?
Yeah, I went in. I signed up for 5 years, 5 and 4 I think it was. Mm-hmm. And I became an engine mechanic.
I'm bound to say, I think service discipline then came as a bit of a shock, didn't it?
After an English boarding school, nothing's a shock. You know, Brixton Prison, it's a doddle, all of that stuff. It's a doddle. You know, I've been to Brixton a lot, but only as a guest. I mean, as a visitor. But I always get the feeling I'd like to move the bed in because I feel completely cosy there.
All right, then talk to us a bit about your RAF career, if you will.
Oh, God. Well, recently I was coming out of Joe Allen's, which is a kind of show business restaurant in Covent Garden, and a voice said, "Oh my God, the man who ruined NATO." And it was my old commanding officer, because I was always the sergeant knew on parade that if he came up to me and pulled my battle dress blouse, a book would fall out, because I read my way through 4 years of the RAF. I just read everything I could get hold of, and I never forget. Because I was interested in opera, I was interested in ballet, I was interested in things you're not supposed to be interested in if you're one of the lads.
Well,
you know, it's a bit much. You know,
yeah.
I mean, I was interested in you know, all the things to do with the theatre. You know, and there was a lot of amateur acting in the services, and I did a lot of it. I was a kind of leading comic. I played all the comedy parts. And that really kept me going, because I did find the whole setup very tedious. You know, I remember the sergeant came in on parade one day and said, "Right, college," used to call me, "Right, college. What have you got now?" And he'd pull my blouse and a book fell out, and it was Ballet for Beginners. And I don't think I ever lived that down. I'd never lived that down. You know, I was not very good at it. I was hopeless at it, and I had a job towing Wellington bombers around. This is how long ago it was, with a tractor. In the Air Force, you get a Daimler tractor. That's typical of British armed services. You know, 15,000 quid on a tractor. You know, pulling this bomb, and I'd be reciting Shakespeare and stuff in my head, and I knocked the end of a wing off on a hangar door, which is why the commanding officer accused me of ruining NATO, bringing NATO to its knees. And I'd stand. I was one of those guys that used to stand and run backwards with 2 lit batons with oily gumboots on wet concrete in drizzle, with a bloody great bomber coming at me with his giant engines roaring, and I'd be shouting Shakespeare into a kind of vortex of silence, so you get into that kind of noise. You know, it's an amazing, it's like a trip in a way. You know, you get into that kind of silence, and I would be doing Romeo, which was my thing at the time, and Juliet. I was a bit confused. You know? I'd be doing all this and running backwards with these darn torches, you know, bringing these aircraft in at night. You know.
So I assume that at some point you were slung out then.
Well, I actually met a bloke called Jack Clayton, who was a cartoonist, Share the Next Bed. And like all comedy cartoonists, he was a manic depressive.
Yeah.
And he taught me the symptoms of manic depression. So I went to the MO, who was a friend of mine, the medical officer, and I gave him all the symptoms of manic depression. And he said, "Right, you can tell your dad if you can get the money, he can buy you out." So my dad raised about 90 quid, and I bought myself out. And I went to the education officer. You had to get clearance. And I said, "I don't know what I'm going to do." And he said, "Well, you're going to be an actor, you twerp." He said, "Everybody knows that." I said, "Well, how?" And he said, "Well, you can go to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and do an audition." I said, "I can't go anywhere royal." And he said, "Well, you're in the Royal Air Force, you Burke." He said, "You get a stamp, you go to the Royal Mail, send a letter off to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and do an audition," which is what I did, you know. And I got a scholarship. And I went there in 1955. Was about the time of Elvis Presley and Teddy Boys.
Oh, marvellous, marvellous.
Car thieves. And, it was amazing. You know, I got to London as a student, and Notting Hill Gate in 1955 was alive. It was full of like characters out of a kind of Berlin show of the 30s. You know, it was all full of decadence and villainy, a lot of villainy. And I spent most times working in a rock and roll bar, doing a bit of speed, you know, and what did we used to eat? Nasal inhalants and swallow them down with Coca-Cola to get high, you know, and drinking a lot and having a great time with the low light, the sleaze of London. I loved it. Blokes would show me how to hotwire cars and all that. It was great. But I'd always fall asleep at the academy, so I got thrown out of the academy eventually.
Did you?
Yeah, well, how could you look at Shakespeare when Elvis Presley was on down the road?
Well, I mean, I personally agree with that, but
Yeah.
I should have thought that a man dedicated to his profession as you were might have took a different view.
Oh, yeah, but the great thing is that if you're part of the kitchen sink, which I was, the kitchen sink theatre revolution, was all about low life. So
That's right.
really hanging out in sleazy bars with screaming queens and drug dealers and teddy boys was research. Because the great thing about acting is that you make a living doing all the things your mother told you never to do, like stare and copy and all those kind of things. You know. That's great. And pretend to be somebody else, dress up in other people's clothes. You know, it's a great profession for lying and cheating, for liars and cheats.
I'm going to send my equity card back. I tell you what. To get you back on the straight and narrow, if we can, then you get thrown out of the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, which, after what you've told me, is not altogether surprising. So what next? How did you then get to tread the boards?
Oh, it's very simple. See, in those days, there used to be terribly posh theatre, where, in Air Force terms, the officers and the officers' wives did all the action, and the Burkes like me, you know, or the working class did all the "oh, God blimey, Gov, I really don't know" kind of acting.
Yeah.
You know, and everybody, oh, really, look here, Simmons, you know. And they were doing all the posh stuff, you know, it was all posh acting. And I hated it. And I remember breaking down in tears with my brother, and I said, I'm a student of something I can't stand. I mean, this is really serious. You know, the old Vic, everybody with a pearl drop earring, one leg bent. Oh, me, my lord, you know, all that stuff's going down. And life is happening, Elvis play, you know, life is happening outside. And suddenly, somebody said to me, there's a great theatre company down the East End called Theatre Workshop, run by a woman called Joan Littlewood.
Yeah.
Go down there. So I went down there, and I saw a play. I saw a play called The Good Soldier Schweik, and it just opened my head up. There was music. I mean, there was mistakes. It wasn't all perfect. People made mistakes. The place was cranky, falling apart. It was pretty scruffy. But it was heaven. It was like the low life that I loved so much. I mean, it was like life, you know. And I always say to young actors when they say, what do you do, where do you go? I say, go around, listen, look and listen. When you hear your music, join the band. And I heard my music. They were talking my language in that theatre. So when the time came, I just went down and auditioned. And I knew I'd get the job. And in my soul, I knew it. I didn't even bother. I just walked in and took my coat off and just sat down. And I remember Joan Little would say, you look at home. And I said, I am, I think I am at home. And I was. And within 3 months of being thrown out of the RADA, I was in Macbeth in the Scottish play at the Moscow Arts Theatre. You know, I mean, it was magic, you know. And then within a year of that, I was in Brendan Behan's The Hostage. Lionel Bart's Things Ain't What They Used to Be, you know, which was all about the low life, you know. Oh, it was unbelievable. You know, Lionel Bart with those wonderful, wonderful lyrics. He'd come in the morning with a song, and you'd just look at it, and you'd know it because it was in your language. You know, what's it? Carve up, there's just been a carve up. We've just seen a carve up from ear to ear. 27 stitches, what a carve up. We're playing Teddy Boys. I've been hanging out with Teddy Boys for 4 years. You know, it was a wonder. And Barbara Windsor and people playing hookers. I've been hanging out with hookers. You know,
Marvellous.
It was just heaven. And it was like a meeting of all the influences of my life all came together in one go. And it was...
Joan Littlewood, magic.
Oh, unbelievable. You know, she hated the respectable theatre. She hated the things that I hated and loved the things that I loved. You know.
At some point, though, surely to goodness, there had to have been a day of reckoning.
Well, you know, I mean, I spent a lot of time with Brendan Behan, you know, and he was great. You know, he was the first kind of battleship of drunkenness that I ever met. A man who was so completely and utterly drunk and utterly proud of it, covered in vomit and singing and swearing and laughing and having a wonderful time and a terrible time at the same time. But he was the most tolerant man I ever met. He was extraordinary. I mean, there was a man who had arrived in England with a bomb in his suitcase, and he got beaten up by the police, and he could understand that. And he got thrown into prison, and he got beaten up in prison, and he could understand that. And then he gets sent to Borstal, and he's put in bed next to a bloke who's exactly the same as him from England. I mean, he's a young bloke. I mean, whereas Brendan was taught to hate the English all of his life, and was taught as a Republican, as a fierce, bigoted Republican, to sleep in a bed next to a bloke, and he actually really loved this English guy. And he had the breadth of vision and the breadth and the tolerance to allow that. Brendan used to say extraordinary things, like he'd say, as Théophile Gautier once said, you know, and he would quote Gautier. He'd quote all the French writers. He spoke a lot of French. You know, he was an incredibly well-read, bright man. You know, he was a big man in many in ways that far transcend all this drunkenness, which was his public image. You know, I learnt a lot from him, a lot. I did, and they were good things. The drink did finally catch up, and it became a nightmare for me.
Look, I tell you what. If you're prepared to tell me about that, then tell me about the nightmare of it.
No, I mean, it was a nightmare because for me, I couldn't stop. You know, and I finished up with a bottle of whiskey under the bed, and I'd have 3 blackouts a day. You know, I'd stagger to the pub, and I'd get drunk and I'd stagger home and crash out, and then I'd stagger there in the evening, I'd stagger back, and then I'd stagger out later. I was having 3 blackouts per day. I mean, it was a nightmare. And I split up with a wife and child. I lost the house. I lost everything. But, that's show business, isn't it, really? I mean,
Well, it is, yes, but
it's life, really. It's not show business.
how much of this did your first wife put up with?
Well, not very much, because after a while she ran off with somebody that gave her a better time, which was reasonable. I thought, we're good friends these days. We've got a son and a grandson in Dublin. It's wonderful. But I mean, nobody's going to put up with anybody that abuses her, shouts and yells, and is always out getting drunk all the time.
So when did you, and I don't use this saying piously, when did you come to your senses? When did you think to yourself, this has got to stop?
Oh, I can't remember when it was. It was a long time ago now. But it was when it became more painful to drink than to stop. So there was no morality in stopping. I mean, if I could have gone on, I think I would. I'm awfully glad it did become more painful, because when I stopped, and this is many years ago now, my life began to open up, and it was extraordinary. I mean, it took a long time. It took time. I got to the bottom of chronic alcoholism, and drug addiction, and I turned round, and with a lot of help from a lot of people, and came back out of it again. I don't want to go into it because it's tedious. But what is wonderful about it is that it's like at the age of 40-odd, you're suddenly given a completely new chance. You start again. But you've got all the experience and all the joy of the past and the sad stuff.
Right.
I mean, I did a play 2 years ago at the Lyric Hammersmith called Hangover Square, which was about an alcoholic schizophrenic who was totally in love with an actress who was indifferent to him. Completely my story, and it broke people's hearts to see it, and it gave me the reviews that I hadn't had for many years. I mean, in every paper in the land, in the Sundays and the dailies, the best reviews an actor could have. It was a wonderful script by Fidelis Morgan, adapted from a Patrick Hamilton novel, with Celia Imrie and Anne Lampton. And we just danced this wonderful thing. I mean, this was all from experience. And if one hadn't had that experience, we couldn't play the play.
I suppose, really, you were also faced with the other problem, which seems to me that must have been inevitable, in that your reputation would have gone before you. And when you started to climb out, surely you were, as it were, black to some extent.
That is the bitch. But that's okay, too, because what it does is it forces you, like, to work on the fringe. And all the new ideas are coming in the fringe, I mean, okay, so the West End don't employ you for a long time. Well, who gives a damn? Because the West End is doing the same old rubbish anyway. They take ages to change in the West End. But the people who are doing the new ideas, like in the Soho Poly where I worked, I worked there. I wrote pantomimes and played the dame in them and directed them, produced them for a theatre in Chipping Norton in Oxfordshire. I wrote about 5 pantomimes for them. I would never have done those things.
No.
I went and lived in a caravan in Cornwall and met a lovely lady. We had 2 little babies. I've now got a daughter, Fanny, who's 16, a son called Barnaby, who's 14. My oldest son, Peter, lives in Dublin. He's 29. Got a grandson called Carl. I mean, life is amazing, really, when you think of it. And I don't think that I would change anything. Quite frankly, except in as much as I've ever hurt other people. Yes.
One final question about your addiction to drink, and then I promise no more. Are you one of those people who now, because of this addiction, can no longer have any at all?
I don't. Yes. Yeah. But. It's so difficult to explain that. I mean, I hesitate. No, it does in a way, because I hesitate to say it to people that like drinking.
Oh yeah, and I like drinking.
Because most people like drinking, and I used to like it, but it got so much on top of me that the choice now, the idea of getting drunk to me is horrendous, because it kills my life. It broke my spirit, and my spirit is repaired and is now flying. I'm 58 years old, and I'm just starting out. I'm cooking, So the idea of drinking or drugging to suppress this energy and imagination and stuff is not worth it. It doesn't interest me.
Good. Okay, so when did things start coming together with the Gogglebox again?
I don't remember, to be honest. Oh, no, let's go back. Yeah, let's go back. Yes, a series called Widows, written by Linda LaPlante.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I played a character in it called Boxer Davis, who actually was an alcoholic. Which is rather. Oh no! In fact, the first job I did on the BBC when I got out in recovery from everything was Juno and the Paycock on BBC, which was my Brendan Behan acting. Who's an alcoholic. It was tremendous with Francis Tumulty, who was married at the time to Sting. And from there we went into the famous Peter O'Toole Scottish play at the Old Vic, and the Macbeth. And I played Matt Duff. And then I had this lovely Boxer Davis in Widows, and from that I went into the Beiderbecke series at Yorkshire, which was great, Alan Plater. And what I was trying to do like mad is to change my image and change, because I got very typecast when I was boozing and drugging as a villain. I got very typecast, and it took me nearly 15 years to break that mould. And I said to my agent, I'm not going to be running around with a gun in my hand anymore. It didn't work. I went down to Cornwall, I went digging potatoes. I worked in the Fringe, I tattered around, and I picked up bits and pieces, but I had to refuse to do it. I worked for Fellini in Rome. I always worked for my lovely Ken Russell, on odd occasions, who always saves your life, Ken. It's great. But I didn't go back to that boring acting. And eventually I played this schoolmaster in the Beiderbecke affair, which was in the 3 Beiderbecke series, which was glorious to do. And then I started working in odd things for Baz Taylor and David Reynolds. That one about snooker that Robert Lindsay did. I did one of those. I did Auf Wiedersehen, not Auf Wiedersehen, Shine on Harvey Moon. And from there was the next step was into Lovejoy. And that was...
Right, talk to us a little bit about Lovejoy, if you will, about the series. But I might as well tell you now that at some point during it, I'm going to have to put to you the theory that somebody who has had as varied a career as you have, and has done as much of the classics as you quite evidently have, seem a surprising candidate to land up in what is effectively a sort of a soap.
Well, is it a sort of a soap?
Well, perhaps soap is the wrong word. It's a long-running television series.
Yes, it is. I mean, I don't know. I can't see it from the outside. It just seems that along comes Lovejoy, which meant Baz Taylor, Ian McShane, Tony Charles, people that I knew and cared about and liked and understood, and they come up with this idea. And it was written a bit like Callan's sidekick, a dirty raincoat, filthy, snivelling, alcoholic, cigarette addict. And I turned it down originally. I didn't want to do it. I said, I don't want to do that. And they said, well, you can wear what you like. And I said, well, I'll wear my Chelsea Arts Club kind of clothes, tweeds and bow tie and a beret that I bought in France. Because I always want to work with a beret. See, you see it in terms of soap. I see it in terms of playing a clown. He's full staff, isn't he, really?
Yeah, right.
He's full staff, he's a bit like Groucho Marx in some ways. He's a whole string of people. I worked with Norman Wisdom once, and he taught me more than most people. Because these clown figures are universal in the theatre and in the movies. And whatever Tinker does, and Tinker is 8 years old.
That's true.
Really, he's 8 years old. He's an 8-year-old boy when he's got his bicycle. He throws his bicycle down. He's 8 years old when a woman points her finger at him and he crumbles up. It's bigger. It's much bigger than a soap.
Well, no, I mean, I'm not criticising. In fact, as a matter of fact, I very, very much enjoy the series. And as I told you before, I've actually walked on it a time or two. But it just seemed to me that it was not the sort of thing that a person like you would then have said, oh, this is for me.
Well, it's amazing at the age of 58 to have an income.
Well, fair comment.
I've never had an income before. I'm buying a bungalow in Cornwall. I mean, bloody hell. And I can look after my kids, because they're getting their teens now. I mean, I bought my son an electric guitar. I mean, Jesus, he can pick up licks, Eric Clapton licks, which is more than I can do.
Yeah, quite. Right, I accept what you say about Lovejoy. I won't call it a soap, but in any case, as I
It's a
said
bloody
before,
expensive soap.
yeah, I enjoy it. So that much we would agree on. You say you're now buying a bungalow in Cornwall, and you're bringing up your little ones now, or rather, they're getting a bit bigger. Where do you see the future?
God, it's so difficult to say. I think what happens is that I mean, like not many people know. I went on with an Irish group called Hothouse Flowers at Wembley Stadium the other day and played a bit of harmonica and danced in front of 78,000 people and went out on Radio 1. I mean, this is ridiculous, and that was the most extraordinary experience. That I don't know, life just pours at me at the moment. It just pours at me from all directions. I love the idea of playing a clown, of being, of this idea, pursuing this idea of this clown that is in Lovejoy at the moment. I mean, it doesn't have to stay in Lovejoy. It can go anywhere. I don't know. I don't know yet. I want to get into more music. A couple of friends asked me if I'd like to join their band the other night. I would love to do a bit of that. I've always liked dancing, comedy dance. I used to love Billy Dainty. He was my hero.
Yes.
I'd like to learn a few of those. I'd like to do the soft shoe shuffle with somebody like Laurel and Hardy do it Way Out West. That is the most elegant. That's more elegant than any ballet to me. I love art that comes out of poverty, and humour that comes out of poverty.
I was going to ask you as a final question whether you ever intended to grow old, but you have in fact prompted me to ask, in the nicest possible sense of the word, whether you are ever intent upon even growing up.
Good God, no. No way. What's the point? It's so much more fun being a child.
Bringing to a close this week's edition of Reflections, my thanks to my guest Dudley Sutton, but as always, my most special thanks to you for listening. Until next week then, bye-bye, and do take special care. Bye-bye now.